Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you so much.
Sorry for the
No, not at all. Thank you so much for inviting us, and it's a real privilege to be with all of you, to be with you, and with Maulana Israr, Madani Sahab, and then with all of you here today. So as he said, I direct an institute for global engagement with religion, and I've been asked to say a few words about what that is and what does it mean to engage religion and how do we do it at the Ansari Institute. So I actually feel not embarrassed, but maybe shy to speak about this topic in front of all of you, because all people here, I think, are actively engaged in the kind of work that we hope to be doing at the highest level. So I'll keep my comments brief, and I think we'll have a lot of interesting things to hear from all of you and in the discussion, and also from Professor Laurie. So the Ansari Institute, just the name Ansari, it comes from Rafat and Zoreen Ansari. They are doctors who live around South Bend, Indiana, which is the city in which the University of Notre Dame is. Notre Dame, does anyone know what that means? It's French. The University of Notre Dame. In French they say Notre Dame. So it means Our Lady. Our Lady. And that is a reference to Hazrat Fatima, Hazrat Maryam alayhi salam. Because Mary is an important figure in the Catholic tradition. So it's a faith-based university. Religion, it has a religious mission. And because of that, it's a little bit distinctive from other major research universities in the United States. And it proudly upholds and advocates for norms. Norms, meaning its values as a faith-based institution. So we are located in a school of global affairs. And the norms that school has adopted derive from Catholic social teachings. And if you can capture that in one line, it is to do good in the world. The technical term for this is integral human development. The development of the whole person, integral development. Meaning not just, when we think of development, we shouldn't just think of economic development. That's just part of a person. We also need to think of their spiritual development, their cultural development. Human beings can flourish only when the whole person is kept in mind. And not just any whole person or a few whole persons, but every person. So human dignity belongs to all people. So this is the normative commitment of the school. And you can see that there can be a lot of conversation on this topic from the perspective of many different religions. And this is why the Ansari Institute, which was founded by this Pakistani couple, Rafat and Zoreen Ansari, with a donation to the university, they founded this institute in this School of Global Affairs for engagement with religion, so that the religions can work together to advance this idea of integral human development. So they take their inspiration from lots of the documents that Pope Francis has authored recently, and that go back also to previous popes in the Catholic tradition and Catholic teachings. But what I bring to the Institute is perspectives from Islam, and we invite also perspectives from other religious traditions to join this conversation. So a core value of the Ansari Institute, how do we engage, is this idea of narrative empathy. That we don't want to speak for other religions, we want them to speak for themselves. And religions are internally diverse, which means that different practitioners of religion in different places, in different times in history, have practiced their religion differently. And so they are not only internally diverse, but they're also constantly evolving. And so what we like to do is talk to specific communities, specific religious actors who are situated in specific contexts to express how they are practicing their traditions from their perspective. A simple example of this is differences within Islam. So if you come to the Islamic University, International Islamic University, you will see certain norms, certain values, and certain ways in which Islam is practiced. If you go to Zaytuna College in Berkeley, California, you might be shocked. This is Islam? What are they doing in Berkeley and interacting the way that they do, both with each other and with the outside community? That's largely not Muslim. And of course, if you go and talk to certain practitioners in other parts of Pakistan or in Afghanistan, you will find different ways of practicing Islam. So, to the outside world, every one of these communities say this is Islam, right? But these Islams are internally pluralistic, diverse, contested, and situated. So what we'd like to do is we try to avoid taking positions between the groups, unless it's, terrible, like, murderous, killing people, and now, the line can be drawn in different places, because some people would say you should not engage a group like the Taliban because they violate human rights, because they exclude women. And so how do we engage a group like that? These are interesting conversations that we're having among ourselves. How can we constructively engage a group like that while believing in this idea of narrative empathy, that each group will have its own story to tell? So let me explain this idea of narrative empathy, which is we define it as the sharing of feeling and perspective taking induced by either reading, viewing, hearing, or imagining narratives of another's situation or condition. So how can we understand the perspectives of other peoples as they would like to be understood? Right? That's the first step in religious engagement.
Rashad, just to break this one and then we will
ट्रांसलेशन की थोड़ी सी ज़रूरत है, मैं
थोड़ी सी कर लेते हैं
ओके।
अच्छा
डॉक्टर साहब ने सबसे पहले तो अंसारी इंस्टीट्यूट के बारे में बताया कि 2 पाकिस्तानी डॉक्टर्स ने उसके लिए डोनेशन दी और उसके ज़रिए से नॉटर डेम यूनिवर्सिटी में ये एक इंस्टीट्यूट कायम किया गया। और नॉटर डेम का इन्होंने मतलब भी बताया कि एक फ्रांसीसी लफ्ज़ है जिसका मतलब है आवर लेडी, यानी हमारी खातून, और इससे मुराद या रेफरेंस इनका जो है वो मरियम अलैहिस्सलाम है। तो इससे हमें अंदाज़ा होता है कि यूनिवर्सिटी बज़ाते खुद एक रिलीजियस ट्रेडिशन के ऊपर कायम की गई है, और जो अब्राहमिक रिलीजन्स हैं उसके अंदर से, और उसमें एक जो बुनियादी बात डॉक्टर साहब ने
So, this idea of engagement with religion is, in at least American academic institutions and even in policy circles, is somewhat recent. In the second half of the 20th century, sociologists of religion followed an idea that has come to be known as the secularization thesis. That as reason, rational thought, and building societies on that basis, spreads and societies develop and they progress and advance, religion is going to recede, go into the background. This thesis has now been more or less rejected, simply because the facts indicate that it doesn't really hold true. In the second half of the then 20th century, there was a number of events that took place that invited a reconsideration of this thesis. So you had, things that are familiar to us. Imam Khomeini, he takes over Iran, right? You have deeply religious wars in the 1980s in our own backyard. And then you have the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, right? And militant Islam. And then ultimately 9/11, right? So this is just one indicator that said, wait a minute, the world has not gotten rid of religion yet. It's not just that it's slowly going to the background, it actually seems to be becoming more and more relevant. And even in the West, you have now what they call Christian nationalism, mostly among white evangelicals, that indicates that religion is still alive and well and relevant. Next to us we have Hindutva in India, which is a kind of political Hinduism that again indicates that religion is alive and well and a strong force in global politics. So with that in mind, we began to see a number of publications that started to address this issue. We began to see engagement of religion that's coming from within the United Nations and also from places like the White House in the United States, where they create a position that's an ambassador of religious freedom, an office of faith-based engagement, and then in the UN, let me see, in 2001 the United Nations declared a dialogue of civilizations. This was actually the efforts of the Iranian president, I'm forgetting his name. Some of you will know.
Hassan Rouhani.
No,
Ahmadinejad.
no, before him. Khatami, yeah, Khatami. Right? He said we should have a dialogue among civilizations, and the UN picked that up. And then there was a UN interagency task force on religion and development, which was founded in 2010. A multi-faith advisory council was constituted just recently in 2018. So you see these developments are fairly recent. You want to translate, and then I will conclude
I will
in my
not,
next section.
I will just briefly give you a gist of what the main points that Dr. Mahan Mirza has just elaborated.
उर्दू में
सॉरी अच्छा, इन्होंने एक तो सेकुलराइजेशन के थीसिस की बात की है कि जब ख़ास तौर पर इंगेजमेंट विद रिलीजन का सिलसिला शुरू हुआ तो अमेरिकन पॉलिसी सर्कल से और अमेरिकन यूँ कह लें कि सियाक़ो सबाक़ में रिलीजियस इंगेजमेंट का सिलसिला शुरू किया गया, इस बात को समझते हुए कि मज़हब अब आज की दुनिया में भी रेलिवेंट है, क्योंकि वो समझते हैं कि दुनिया की एक बहुत बड़ी तादाद जो है वो मज़हब से किसी न किसी हवाले से वाबस्ता है या किसी न किसी मज़हब या अक़ीदे के साथ वाबस्ता है। तो अगर आपने उनको इंगेज करना है तो उनके इस बुनियादी अक़ीदे को ज़रूर मद्देनज़र रखना है। तो लेकिन उस पर फिर ये एतराज़ हुआ, ये एक रीसेंट फिनामिना है, यानी ये कोई बहुत पुरानी बात नहीं है, ये हाल ही में ये तहरीक शुरू हुई और उसके नतीजे में सेकुलराइजेशन थीसिस आया कि ये समझा गया कि ये जो रिलीजियस इंगेजमेंट ख़ास तौर पर सेकुलर हलकों की तरफ से की जा रही है, इसका मकसद ये है कि रिलीजन को कमज़ोर किया जाए और उसके नतीजे में जो सेकुलर आइडियाज़ हैं उनको हम आगे फ़रोग़ दें। लेकिन इस थीसिस को फर्दर फिर स्कॉलरशिप के ज़रिए से रिजेक्ट किया गया और उसके नतीजे में रिकन्सिडरेशन में हमें बहुत सारी चीज़ें नज़र आती हैं, लेकिन इसी दौर में सियासी और समाजी सतह पर हमें मज़हब का एक बढ़ता हुआ असर दुनिया भर में नज़र आता है, जिसमें आप ये कह सकते हैं कि 1980 में जो मजहबी जंगें शुरू हुई और उसके बाद इस्लामिक फंडामेंटलिज्म की इस्तिलाह ईजाद हुई, मिलिटेंट मूवमेंट्स शुरू हुई, यानी जो अस्करियत पसंद मुस्लिम तहरीकें शुरू हुई और उन्होंने मुस्लिम आइडियल्स के ऊपर या इस्लामिक आइडियल्स के ऊपर एक पूरी तहरीक को जन्म दिया और आगे जाकर ये 9/11 पर मुंतज हुआ। कि जिसके बाद ये हुआ। तो यहाँ पे आप ये कह लें कि इसके साथ साथ जब इस्लाम के अंदर ये तहरीकें चल रही थी तो उसके मुकाबले में क्रिश्चियन नेशनलिज्म भी बढ़ा।
Alright, so आखिरी बात, the examples that I have given about the relevance of religion in global affairs are mostly negative, and the religion is a problem. But on the other hand, religion also contributes positively in society in so many ways, in providing relief, in providing healthcare, in providing humanitarian aid and services, and in peace building and reconciliation. And so, what the Ansari Institute is interested in is really in amplifying that area of global engagement with religion, where religions are playing a positive role in shaping world affairs. And lastly, let me conclude with just this section I pulled out from Martin Luther King Jr.'s book. His last book was called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? That was with a question mark, the title of the book. Where do we go from here? And the last chapter of that book is called The World House. And I think it really captures something that we're trying to do, as far as I understand it, at the Keough School, but also that's our School of Global Affairs at Notre Dame, but also at the Ansari Institute. So this is how Martin Luther King Jr. begins that chapter. Some years ago, a famous novelist died. Among his papers was found a list of suggested plots for future stories, the most prominently underscored being this one. And then he quotes this, what he was hoping to write, this novelist who died. A widely separated family inherits a house in which they have to live together. This was like an unwritten story. So then Martin Luther King Jr. continues. This is the great new problem of mankind. We have inherited a large house, a great world house, in which we have to live together. Black and white, Easterner and Westerner, Gentile and Jew, Catholic and Protestant, Muslim and Hindu. A family unduly separated in ideas, culture and interest, who, because we can never again live apart, must somehow learn to live with each other in peace. So that's our mission.
That's wonderful.
Mediation is an effort by a third party to help parties in conflict to resolve their conflict to their satisfaction. That's a standard definition of mediation, and we do mediation within families, within communities, throughout the world, throughout time. It's an ancient practice. In all communities across the world at all times, there are people in our communities, sometimes faith leaders, sometimes secular leaders, who play the role of the mediator. The United Nations specializes in a particular kind of mediation, which is mediation in high intensity conflict, violent conflict. United Nations, emerging after the end of World War II, has many objectives, but one overarching objective: prevent another war, prevent another world war. So the United Nations takes mediation and peacemaking very seriously. I'm going to give you a brief overview of what the United Nations does, and then list 5 characteristics of United Nations mediation, and then 5 challenges. In most
नहीं, मैं सिर्फ आपसे पूछना चाहता हूँ कि कोई उर्दू में बताने की ज़रूरत है या I think it's okay, right?
Clear.
You're clear?
All right, thank you.
Doctor Sir?
So in most major conflicts, but not all, the United Nations is involved either as the lead mediator or in support of a regional organization, which is the mediator, or sometimes in support of a domestic organization, which is the mediator. The United Nations, for example, and I'm addressing a question from the colleague on my right that was posed earlier, about religious organizations contributing to peace building.
Yeah.
Right? This is an example of the role that the United Nations would play in support of faith-based peacemaking. In the 2011 presidential election in Nigeria, in Africa, there was great fear of a civil war breaking
Civil
out.
War, yeah.
There was a fear that whichever party lost the election would reject the result, and there would be war. The United Nations was not the lead mediator. It supported a local, domestic level, faith-based coalition of Muslim and Christian leaders that had one common message to all the political parties: behave without violence. No violence. That was the message. And the religious leaders drew up a code of conduct that they were able to pressurize all the presidential candidates into signing. And it's a very interesting example of how mediation can be effective without power. The religious leaders in this body known as the National Peace Council, they have no formal power. They have no formal status, but they have the authority of the word, of the book, and of their own integrity. And they were difficult to ignore. The United Nations in that situation said correctly, we don't need to be the lead mediator. We have confidence in this religious group, the National Peace Council, and we will support their efforts. But in the big civil wars, Yemen, Syria, South Sudan, the United Nations is the mediator of last resort, meaning when all other mediators have failed, we look to the United Nations. And it has two objectives in relation to mediation: prevent violence, if possible, before violence breaks out, and if it breaks out, resolve the conflict. Now, what are the characteristics of United Nations mediation? 5 characteristics. 1, it is committed to professionalization of mediation, meaning the mediator should be properly trained. They should be familiar with the science and the art of mediation. Mediation is partly a matter of intuition. Some people are good and some are less good at mediation, but it's also a science. There is a collection of techniques and tactics that make for more effective mediation, and we can teach and learn these tactics. I run the United Nations high-level mediation course. I'm going to Switzerland in 2 weeks' time. It happens in Switzerland every year. We're training senior United Nations diplomats in the science of mediation. So that's the first characteristic, professionalism. As opposed to any diplomat can do mediation, which is problematic because some diplomats do mediation well and others do that terribly. Second characteristic, which is positive, a commitment to deep analysis. So for mediators who are professional in the United Nations, they say the greatest sin of mediation, the greatest sin is ignorance. When you are trying to mediate in a situation and you are not familiar with the history of the conflict, the dynamics of the conflict, all the parties and their interests and needs. So there's consequently a big emphasis on good analysis, very deep, thorough analysis before we act as mediators. Thirdly, a commitment to impartiality. Very important that we understand that impartiality is not the same thing as neutrality. United Nations mediators would say, we are not neutral on values. We are committed to upholding and promoting the values of the United Nations. but we are impartial, meaning we are not going to take sides. We are going to treat all the sides fairly. That is very difficult in armed conflict where one side or many sides have done really terrible things. It's very difficult psychologically, emotionally, ethically to treat all of them fairly. But if you don't, as the mediator, they will not trust you, and if they don't trust you, you can't be effective. The fourth characteristic of United Nations mediation is it is framed by the values of the organization. And we make no apology for that. The critical documents are the UN Charter, which prohibits acts of aggression, amongst other things. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a commitment to fundamental rights and freedoms. And then there are new emerging policies such as UN Security Council Resolution 1325, known as the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. All these policies have been agreed to by all member states. So the United Nations is not tolerant of the argument, these are Western values. These are your values, not our values. The United Nations response is, you, member states, signed these documents. So you are committed to them, and you are obliged to obey them. I'm going to present an argument against that in a minute. And then the fifth characteristic, we seek not just to end violence, but to prevent violence breaking out in the future. Because what's the point of getting a ceasefire if a week later or a year later the fighting starts again? And to do effective prevention, we have to help the conflict parties address what we call the structural problems, the root causes. What is happening in a society that gives rise to large-scale violence? And the aim of the mediation then is to help the parties address these underlying problems. What are the challenges? I'll be more brief now. The first and the biggest challenge is that parties in serious conflict don't want mediation. They want to kill each other. They want to win. If they were happy to cooperate, they wouldn't need mediation. Right. So what we are offering, cooperation, coexistence, is exactly what they do not want. And we are not demigods. We are not a magician with a wand. We are not a general in command of an army. We don't have power as a mediator. We rely on the parties' consent and cooperation. And they don't want to give it to us. Look at Syria. Look at Yemen. These wars can go on for years because the parties are in, we'll use the term, zero-sum game, meaning you win it all. Which means if I win it all, you lose it all. And we are not willing, because of what you have done, to cooperate with you, and you have the same attitude to me. So this is our biggest challenge. The parties don't want this. Second challenge, because the parties don't want mediation, we have to apply pressure on them. Sanctions, ICC, International Criminal Court, arms embargo. The problem is, when you put pressure on a party, you may make that party even more resistant, not less resistant, to United Nations mediation. We've got many, many examples of that. Third challenge, we like to say that the United Nations mediation is impartial, yeah, but great power politics in the Security Council is very, very relevant. And you know that the Security Council has 5 members, the major powers after World War II, that have a veto. United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia, China. They are able to block mediation. They have the power to block mediation. So if we are concerned with Russia, Ukraine, the UN doesn't get involved properly, seriously. If it's the US invasion of Iraq, the United Nations can't get involved seriously because at the highest level, the Security Council, the United States has a veto. So in that sense, we are not fair and we are not impartial. We serve often the interests of the great powers, or at least the great powers can block UN mediation, which is very problematic. Fourth big challenge, we prize peace as the highest value. We regard war as the worst case scenario. Now, anyone who's lived in a war would appreciate why this is so important. We're not romantic about war. But for some groups that resort to war, justice is more important than peace. But not from the UN perspective. My nationality is South African. I grew up in the era of apartheid. As a student, I was a member of the African National Congress, the liberation movement, fighting against apartheid, which was an underground movement. I was committed to armed struggle against the apartheid regime because justice was more important than peace. But that is not the United Nations perspective. And then last challenge, I said to you that the UN claims to be committed to universal values because all member states sign the key text. But we know this is not true in reality. The United Nations does not reflect Eastern values for the most part. It doesn't reflect Chinese values for the most part. It reflects Western liberal values. But it pretends to be culture universal or culture neutral, when in fact the institution as a whole and its mediation in particular are promoting a Western liberal agenda, which for some conflict parties is fine, but for many other conflict parties is highly objectionable. And the United Nations, when it's mediating, is not sufficiently flexible to take account of the religion, ethnicity, cultural values of the local conflict parties. So I end with the challenges as well as the positive features. Thank you.
This is not human. So there is always this risk of violence erupting again. So how do you respond to that?
There are two political problems though. So I agree with the point in general. I was having lunch with a colleague, I don't think he's in the room.
Yeah.
Yes,
Left.
Okay. Who said, if you want peace, prepare for war. But really, I think if you want peace, prepare for justice.
Exactly.
So I share that view. But here are at least two obstacles when you mediate. The one is the parties, when they mediate and reach a negotiated settlement, have to compromise. All of them have to compromise. No compromise, no end to the war. If I'm mediating between two of you, you cannot get 100% of what you want. You cannot get 100% of what you want. You have to compromise. And you are often compromising on justice. So that's one problem. The second problem is that these mediations happen with elites. They don't happen with ordinary folk. Workers are not represented at the table. It's usually men, sometimes women, but usually men in suits and ties, even if they're rebels, that are sharing the wealth and power amongst them. So you have an elite deal being done, which is not in the interest of justice. So if we're concerned about justice in terms of class, meaning it's also working class that need justice from a deal, they usually are losers. It's the elites across the enemy lines that come together. South Africa is what happened at the expense of the majority of people who are workers. It's very difficult for mediators to stop that happening because we are the servants of the conflict parties. It's their process. It's their mediation. It's their war. It's their peace agreement. It's not ours. We're there to help them. And if we are too assertive about our needs and our values, the parties will say, we don't need you. We'll find another mediator. So we are trying to be influential without having a lot of power. And we're compromising on justice, I think, consistently.
Thank you very much. Before inviting more questions from the audience, I just want to say one more thing about, you said that UN supported faith-based coalition in Nigeria. And then it clicked in my mind the story of Imam al-Shafa and Pastor James. I think they were also part of the, and it also relates with the topic that Dr. Mahan Mirza has talked about. There is a story of positive, constructive religious diplomacy or religious engagement in Nigeria, where one Muslim Imam al-Shafa, and one Christian pastor, Pastor James, they actually joined hand together to resolve conflicts, because the major conflict in Nigeria is between Christians and Muslims. So when you make joint efforts and have this intra-faith or interfaith coalitions, that can also work to resolve some of the misunderstandings and also to pacify the hot emotions that people might react based on. So, am I correct? Is it the Pastor James? Okay, thank you. So, sorry for my intervention. Now it's open for questions. You can ask questions to both of the speakers.
मेरा सवाल है कि पाकिस्तान में आजकल जो सियासी का इस्तेकाम है, यूएन इसमें अपना किरदार अदा करते हैं।
Pakistan facing political instability, do you think UN has a role in helping to stabilize Pakistan?
Not for the foreseeable future, because one of the United Nations cardinal principles is non-interference in domestic affairs. So this is the principle of sovereignty, and it's arguably one of the 2 or 3 most significant features of the international system, and therefore of the United Nations, respect for sovereignty. So, sad to say, things have to get a lot worse before the United Nations would consider some kind of involvement. In other words, people have to die in large numbers, but if that is not happening, the United Nations is not going to get involved. I was involved in the United Nations African Union mediation for Darfur in Sudan, 2005-2006. But this is a context where 300,000 people have been killed. And it's ethnic cleansing or genocide. At that level of conflict, the United Nations will step in, and we don't care about sovereignty. But in a situation of political crisis like Pakistan now, and my own country, South Africa now, the United States now, United Nations would never get involved. And member states don't want to get involved in these crises, because if I get involved as United Nations in your crisis, tomorrow you're coming into my country. I don't want you in my country, thank you. So, bottom line, it has to be a lot worse than it is currently. And worse means death toll.
Ji, any more questions, please?
Sir, are military-industrial complex also involved in blocking peace building and mediation?
That's a great question. I haven't seen that. They have an interest in war and the perpetuation of war, but there's no shortage of war, and there's no shortage of production of weaponry. Where I see it, especially in Africa, it's not quite the military-industrial complex, the problem that you're raising. It's where governments and rebels that are involved in violent conflict are profiting from the war. So they don't want the war to end. In other words, they're not interested in resolving the conflict. They are plundering diamonds or timber or gold or whatever it is, and they are getting rich on war production. So it's not quite military-industrial complex in the big kind of United States sense, but they are at a local level, I guess, part of the military-industrial complex, whose interests are served by perpetuation of war, and therefore who have no interest in peace.
Thank you.
So kindly briefly elaborate the role of UN peacekeeping on Kashmir issue.
On Kashmir.
Role of UN. on Kashmir, because they already have 2 resolutions passed in late 40s or 50s, and still unresolved.
I don't have enough expertise to be able to answer that question adequately, sorry.
मेरा ख्याल है नीलम से ले लेते हैं पहले, ठीक, और फिर इनको हम हमेशा आखिर में रखते हैं, लेकिन आज
नहीं, मैं चाहती हूँ औरों को भी मौका मिले. Well, one of my questions was related to Kashmir issue, but you've already addressed that. However, what we see in the world today is that injustice for one party is termed has a singular term, and the other party has another term. For example, this Palestine and Israel issue. Israel, if we talk about it, Israelis call it xenophobia, but then again, Palestinians, they are being pushed out of their homes, and the whole thing. What is and you've already mentioned that you're not going to intervene in bigger power issues like Ukraine and Russia or Syria and US, but is the UN planning for any kind of mediation between Palestine and Syria? One.
And Israel.
Palestine and Israel. Number 2, question number 2. You said that, and it is obviously quite clear that it is one of the principles of the UN that they will not intervene in domestic issues. But then again, it was reported by Amnesty recently that shutting down internet or shutting down cellular connections and shutting down media is against human rights. It is a human rights violation. If you're not intervening in domestic issue directly, is the UN planning to do anything about it? Third question, like informal related to your UN programs. I've been following UN quite a lot, and I see that there is this UN diplomats program for young diplomats, but that is not funded. You talked about certain programs. What if you start a fully funded UN Peace Champions program, because you said that you want to disperse peace? So instead of going in yourself, why don't you pick in local people, train them, and then send them back as these UN Peace Champions in their own countries?
As usual, a number of good questions.
So to start with Israel-Palestine, I think it's a great example of the United Nations being immobilized by great power politics, in this case by the US position. The UN is officially part of an alliance with the European Union and the US and Russia as the quartet responsible for what they call the Middle East peace process, which is Israel-Palestine. In reality, this is US turf, and the UN will not interfere, because the US will say, get out, this is our problem. And as we know, the US is an ally of Israel, and it's not committed to any serious engagement, meaning putting pressure on Israel. So the US, it's a good example of how the US keeps the UN out of. The UN doesn't have more power than its member states. It is a collection of member states. And the most powerful member states have the most power within the United Nations system. I didn't address the question of Kashmir, but I suspect that that's the same dynamic. If India does not want United Nations involved in mediating on Kashmir, whatever the resolutions, and India's position is backed by the United States, the United Nations is not going to get involved. So we would like to think that the United Nations is a benign, altruistic, universal suite of organization. Some of its components are UNICEF, WHO, are seriously professional, committed to advancement of humankind. But the Security Council is a citadel of great power politics and blocks the UN from going often where it's needed most. The principle of non-interference, it's not intrinsically a bad principle, I mean, the principle of sovereignty and non-interference is meant to protect the weak against the strong. I mean, that's the idea. Strong states don't worry about interference from weak states. It's weak states that worry about interference from strong states. So, in principle, this is a good axiom of international law. The problem, of course, is that it allows states to abuse their own citizens extensively. But my response to that is the same as my response to your question. It has to be massive level of human rights abuse, massive, before the UN will even make a statement, let alone intervene. And you will remember that we had this emergence of the doctrine called R2P, responsibility to protect, which was an argument against sovereignty. The argument went as follows: yes, states have sovereign rights over their own territory and citizens, but when states fail to look after their own citizens, the international community has a responsibility to get involved. And the P3, the UK, the US, France, abused that principle when they pursued regime change against former President Gaddafi in Libya. And they killed the principle of R2P because they were cynical and sought to manipulate this humanitarian principle for the purpose of regime change. So the United Nations, bottom line, is not going to intervene, even by way of a statement, unless the situation is catastrophic. I'm not saying it's good or bad, I'm just saying that's the way, that's international politics. In terms of this idea of young champions for peace, great. I mean, bring it on, do it. I mean, it's in your hands. Don't look here at the head of the table, it's in your hands, do it. What's stopping you?
Well, we're doing it already.
Fantastic.
We want you to sponsor us a little.
But they need training and facilitation.
I do training everywhere in the world. I did training with South Sudan Council of Churches. I did training for 10 years in Cape Town. I do training in my new adopted home, South Bend, Indiana, in the United States. I train community level mediators, I train international mediators. There's a ton of training out there. Grab it, invite it, advance yourselves, your future is in your hands.
Thank you. आपका सवाल था?
Yes, sir.
जी.
मैं उर्दू में UN पीस कीपिंग मिशन जहाँ भी चली गई तो बहुत हद तक उसको सक्सेशन मिल गई है। जिस तरह अगर हम लाइबेरिया में देखें,
क्या मिल गई है?
मतलब कामयाब हुए हैं UN पीस कीपिंग मिशन, जो उसका मकसद होता है। लेकिन अगर हम यूगोस्लाविया में देखें तो UN पीस कीपिंग मिशन की वजह से यूगोस्लाविया 3 हिस्सों में तकसीम हो गया, 3 हिस्से हो गए। या अगर हम रवांडा में देखें तो वहाँ भी वो वायलेशन जो मैसिव वायलेंस थी अभी तक जारी है, और भी साउथ सूडान में भी यही सिचुएशन है। मेरा पहला क्वेश्चन ये है कि आया जो UN पीस कीपिंग मिशन है उसको जो UNHCR 1325 जो प्रिंसिपल बनाए थे उसमें कुछ चेंजेस नहीं लाने चाहिए कि वो वहाँ बेहतर तरीके से इम्प्लीमेंट हो जाए। दूसरा क्वेश्चन मेरा ये है कि अभी करंटली सर्बिया में वायलेंस जारी है, वहाँ आर्म वायलेंस है, तो वहाँ UN पीस कीपिंग मिशन का क्या रोल है?
कहाँ पे?
सर्बिया। और तीसरा क्वेश्चन मेरा ये है कि UN पीस कीपिंग मिशन सिर्फ कन्फ्लिक्ट रिजोल्यूशन और प्रिवेंटिव वायलेंस पर फोकस करती है या जो अदर ह्यूमैनिटेरियन क्राइसिस है उस पर भी फोकस करती है? जिस तरह अगर डिफॉरेस्टेशन हो गया, अदर वाटर रिसोर्सेज हो गए, इस पर भी काम करती है।
The UN, so let me draw a conceptual and terminological distinction between peacekeeping missions, which is the term that you were using, Rashan. So peacekeeping is different from peacemaking. Peacekeeping is where there is a peace to be kept. The parties have signed a ceasefire or a full peace agreement, but they don't trust each other to honor the commitment. And then the United Nations deploys the Blue Helmet troops as a peacekeeping mission. They are getting better over time because the UN is very rigorous about assessing independently having independent assessments of its peacekeeping missions to avoid making the same mistakes. So they do get better. Peacemaking is different. It's when there's no peace and the parties are still fighting, and the United Nations sends in mediators to help the parties end the conflict. We fail more often than we succeed. Why? Because the parties are not committed to mediation. And you can't bludgeon them into submission. Peacemaking, mediation, is consensual by definition, not ethically, normatively, by definition. We mediate with the consent of the parties. If they don't want us to mediate, what do? We failed on Darfur, first African Union 2005-2006, then joint AU United Nations 2010-2011, all failed. This is the best mediators, failed consistently because the government of Sudan was not willing to be fair and generous to the rebels and communities in Darfur. So that was a huge failure. At the end of the day, whose failure is it? It's the party's failure. It's not the peacemaker. You know the expression in English, you can take the horse to the water, but you can't make it drink?
Exactly.
Yeah? Now, if I'm mediating in a domestic environment, my own country, low-level conflict, if we fail and there's violence, the police step in. So at some point, you give up as a mediator and it becomes a law enforcement problem. At the international level, it's much more difficult, much more complicated, much more sensitive. On Kosovo and Serbia and former Yugoslavia, basically the US, United States, was the key mediator, and they bombed the hell out of the Serbs, and they put a frozen peace in place, which arguably was better than war and ethnic cleansing, but has created a frozen conflict. There is ongoing tension, as you know, between Kosovo and Serbia. In that case, it's the European Union that is the lead mediator. And then, I'm not trying to the point about water, but just to say there are many United Nations agencies that are specialized in many things, including water issues. So I'm only speaking about that part of the UN that does mediation. But I'm not sure I understood that last point, so.
Thank you. Is there any question from the last? Yes. Up, ji.
Sir, it is true that United Nations is used just to for little state or superpower state.
क्योंकि ये
समझ नहीं आ रही आपके सवाल जरा ऊंचा बोलें.
United Nations is a tool of people power.
It is true that United Nations is used for as a tool for little powers or other world superpowers.
I would say in many instances, yes, but not in all cases. So it becomes a tool of major powers where major powers want it to be their tool. But where they don't, then the United Nations acts in a much more fair and impartial way. In many African conflicts, the major powers are not getting in the way of the United Nations. They let the UN get on with the UN business, and that's great to see. In the Middle East, it's much more complicated because the US and Russia still see the Middle East as an arena of geopolitical competition and economic interest. So they're not allowing the UN to be effective in the Middle East. So it really may depend from one region to the other. But as I said earlier, if it's a conflict in which Russia is involved directly or indirectly, or the US directly or indirectly, the Council is not going to get involved because of the veto, but the P5 have. So yes, it is sometimes a tool of major powers, but not always.
Thank you very much. We'll have just one last question from Ms. Robel. You had for Dr. Mirza, so you have this chance to ask this.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I had a question related to your institution that I would like to know the fundings and budgeting policies about religious affairs in US. And my second question was, what are the other tools you use to promote the interfaith harmony except for the exchange program you did for Doha and Nepal?
So you're asking about the budget of the institute?
No, not for. I'm just asking the general laws and budgeting policies as per the U.S. laws.
I have no idea. Religion in the United States, we have what's called the Establishment Clause, which permits the free exercise of religion, but doesn't allow the state to enact any laws that are religious in nature. So the US government is very reluctant to get into religious issues, but it takes great care in allowing the free exercise of religion. So there's lots of conversation in terms of policy that relate to freedom of religion, where one group or another will say that this law that is coming from the federal government is violating our religious freedom, and then those things will be litigated. A good example of this is when Barack Obama, he passed the National Health Care Law, and part of that, those healthcare reforms, that it required every institution, out of fairness, to have provide certain kinds of healthcare as mandatory basic healthcare, and it included things like contraception, and which violates Catholic social teachings, right? And there are other religious groups that say we shouldn't be forced to offer these services. So there was a lawsuit that the federal government is overreaching. These things started to be revised when the White House established its Office of Faith-Based Initiatives. Initially, they said that the government should, while it's not enacting any laws that are religious in nature and not preventing the free exercise of religion, it should not discriminate against religious organizations when it comes to federal funding. Because in the past, federal funds wouldn't go to religious organizations because the federal government cannot support faith-based initiatives. That would be a violation of the free exercise clause. But then the argument was made that this is unfair discrimination also against faith-based organizations that are doing wonderful community service. And so most faith-based organizations are private, but the government will try to enter into partnerships with them while trying to balance the free exercise clause of the Constitution. So, there's a budget for the White House office, and there's an office in USAID that manages relationships with faith-based communities, and I'm not sure what those budgets are, but that's the framework for engagement. And your second question was?
What tools are you using except for the fellowship program?
Oh, what tools we're using?
Yeah, except for the fellowship program to promote the interfaith harmony.
For interfaith harmony. So what we do is, we're not necessarily talking about interfaith harmony. What we're talking about is a multi-faith engagement. So, sometimes you may not have harmony, but you want to avoid discord and create understanding. So we don't generally use the word harmony. What we do is, one of the things we do is we invite faith-based actors, leaders from different communities to represent themselves. So one example of this is in the 2020 presidential election, we invited 3 different evangelical voices, because the evangelical community was very active in politics, and they were relevant in the public conversation about national politics. So we invited evangelical leaders, and we had a panel called Faith and the Presidency. And we had a moderator who engaged with them on their perspective on this question. During Black History Month, we invited African American leaders from different parts of the country to talk about issues that confront the African American community and the Black church. And so we engage religious actors from specific communities. And we don't always have multi-faith panels, We can have single faith panels to deepen our understanding of the various communities side by side. As far as multi-faith engagement, one of our recent initiatives is we identify a book that is rooted within a religious tradition, speaks normatively from that tradition to an issue in global affairs. And so last year we invited an Aboriginal author from Australia who was speaking about world systems and climate justice. And then we invited 10 different religious voices to engage that book from their own faith traditions, to respond to that book. So that's one way in which we engage. We structure our multi-faith engagement. So they don't all have to agree, but they're speaking to an issue that's important to everybody while they're able to amplify their own faith perspective. And we hope that that conversation will be generative in some way. I want to say one last thing that didn't have anything to do with the question. So our program, the Keough School of Global Affairs, where Professor Nathan and I are, we have a Master of Global Affairs degree. It's called MGA degree. And it has been fully funded for the past several years. Now some positions are fully funded and some are partially funded. And that has 3 different tracks, one in global affairs, one in global development, and one in peace studies. And we have alumni who have graduated from that program who are from Pakistan. And so if you are interested in applying and coming to study to enhance your training and to broaden your horizons and have deep cross-cultural experiences, please consider applying to our program. And if you need any support with that, just contact one of us and we'll guide you through it.
Thank you very much.